Hi, I'm Pastor Ben at Trinity United Methodist Church. So, each of the four Gospels share about Jesus' life and ministry, but each one does so in a slightly different way. And when you stop and you think about the idea of, well, we've heard of the analogy of four different people at four different corners of the same four-way stop see a wreck, and they each give a different story. So it makes sense that each one of these gospel writers would have a different perspective on Jesus' life, how they saw him, how they saw his life, how they saw his ministry. And each one of them would have a different kind of relationship when it comes to relating with Jesus. I mean, we see that in our own lives. We have, say, our relationship with our brother or our sister. It will be a different kind of relationship than our brothers and sisters' relationship with your parents, than with their friends, than with their significant others. So it makes sense. This is all to say, though, that none of these perspectives would be wrong. All right, so just because they have different perspectives, don't think of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. One of them have to be wrong. No, they just see things a little bit different. When it comes to Matthew's gospel, the author is emphasizing Jesus as King of the Jews, and he places more emphasis on Jesus' teachings and points out how he fulfills the words of the law and the prophets, essentially pointing out how Jesus fulfills the foundation of the Jewish faith. For Matthew was a Jew, and Matthew was writing for the Jewish community. Mark's gospel is arguably the most straightforward of the four gospels, and he emphasizes Jesus as the suffering servant. He is arguably also the most straightforward about Jesus' authority, as the whole book is a declaration of Jesus' work. It's also important to note that Mark is likely if not the primary source material for both Matthew and Luke. So, the physician's gospel, Luke's gospel, his primary description of Jesus is that he is Savior for all. And if you missed that in Luke's gospel, I'm not sure you actually read it. Being the physician that he was, Luke attempts to educate the readers by arranging the details of Jesus' life and ministry in order. And we realize that Luke was not Jewish, and he is really trying to speak to other non-Jews as his primary audience. And then finally, we get to John. For John, he really pushes the concept, he really pushes the idea that Jesus is God. John's gospel is likely the most inspiring of the four, as he's trying to inspire belief. John's gospel was written well after the other three gospels and has mostly unique content from the others. John focuses on signs and statements, hence the more inspirational tone to his gospel. It's also evident that John spends more time emphasizing the relationships in Jesus' story than the other Gospels do. Now, I recognize that that's a lot of nice information, but I share all of that to help you set up how interesting it is that in this morning's Gospel reading that you can find from John chapter 6, 5 through 23, that this feeding of the 5,000, which was more likely closer to 10 to 15,000, but that's a whole other tangent for a whole other day. But in this feeding of these thousands of people, this is the only miracle that happens, that is mentioned, that is talked about in all four of the Gospels. For some reason, this picnic on the side of a hill, it managed to capture the imagination of all of the gospel writers to believe that this is one of those moments that helped to define their perspective of Jesus. Obviously, Jesus did a lot of really cool and inspirational things, did a lot of miracles, but there must be something special about this particular miracle that all four of these gospel writers felt that it was important to share. There may be some hidden clues that are hidden in John's text to help us guess as to why this is. One example is that when we consider mountain scenery being used, this is usually a sign that something important is going to happen. After all, throughout the Bible, mountains are used for those instances where some type of dialogue or event between God and humankind happen. Abraham almost sacrificing Isaac and then being halted by an angel. Moses gathering the 10 Commandments up on Mount Sinai. The prophet Ezekiel standing on the mountain where he realizes that God's voice isn't in the massive earthquakes or the fires or the tornadoes, but rather that God's voice is in the stillness. Maybe this is a scenic cue that this is important for us to pay attention to. Thus, the gospel writers felt it was important to share. And Jesus is sitting down. This is a clear indication that we're going to be here for a while. So let's lean in and listen to what is about to be shared. John also points out how the Passover was near. For those of us familiar with the narrative of Jesus' life, we can also place this event as important in the timeline of Jesus' life and death. There's also this interesting thing where 3 of the 4 Gospels link this feeding story along with the story of Jesus walking on water. Another important story where fear is being taken on and tackled. And maybe there's this unspoken realization that fear and hunger are 2 universal experiences that we all as human beings face and experience, and we meet our needs, both physical and emotional, in Jesus. There's also the idea that both of these stories, with Jesus walking on water and the feeding of all those people, they end with attempts to try to control Jesus with our understanding and our expectations. And in both cases, the attempts fail. It's a reminder for us that Jesus doesn't come on our own terms, but on His. So, question, how might the story of the feeding of 5,000 plus be a story of people trying to control the narrative that Jesus is laying out here? Well, consider what Jesus' own disciples are saying in response to Jesus' directions here. Jesus asked Philip, as a test, knowing full well how he was going to respond, where are we to buy bread for these people to eat? And instead of telling Jesus that there happens to be this lovely wholesale bakery just down the road of the town, just next door, instead, Philip answers this question of where, but instead responds with a how much. Instead of saying, hey, here's where we can get bread, Philip replies to Jesus, we don't have enough to provide for all these people. Forget about the where can we get the bread, where are we going to get the money? Andrew at least attempts to try to figure out to answer Jesus' original where question, but after only finding one boy with a basket with a few loaves and a couple fish, and he kind of gives up super quick here. I mean, this kid has food, Jesus, but there's no way it'll be enough for all of us here. On this end, knowing how the story ends, from our perspective, it can be really easy for us to roll our eyes and with grins on our faces and deride the disciples by saying, oh, you silly disciples, don't you know any better? This is Jesus we're talking about here. But let's be honest, we don't really know any better either ourselves. We get caught up in the limitations that we see or we get stuck on the how all too often ourselves. We want to explain how it happened, this feeding of the 5,000 plus people, because if we know, we can at least feel like we have some control over it. Because at least then we could understand it. We might say that when Jesus started disseminating the food, once this young boy bravely decided to share what he had generously, to share what little he had, others felt like, well, if that boy is sharing, then maybe I can share too. And we can turn this into a miracle that people's hearts changed towards sharing. And that's valid, I think, to a degree. That others were compelled and inspired, and that's a miracle in and of itself. But even if that is how it happened, focusing on the how in this story winds up diminishing the real direction that we see this story heading. Because it's not a how story. Instead, it's more of a who story. Or even realizing that there's a couple different who's here. The answer to who is who number one is your typical Sunday school answer, Jesus. The guy who asked, "Where will we buy the bread?" It was Jesus. We should know that the correct answer to that question that Philip should have responded with was, "Well, from you, Jesus, that's where we can get the bread." When the sea that the disciples were rowing their boat on was getting rather rambunctious, and then they found themselves afraid when they saw this figure walking up to them, they heard Jesus say, "It is I, do not be afraid." Some translations have him saying, "I am," which are words that sound familiar to us. But this time, these words, "I am," aren't coming from a burning bush. We find it coming from Jesus. We find it coming from the meter of our needs, the worker of miracles. Which brings us to the second who. And I'm hoping that this is obvious. That second who is us. Or them, those who find themselves hungry on the side of the mountain, which winds up actually being us today as well, because we find ourselves hungry or in need and unable to provide for ourselves. But see, we're also invited to this picnic that Jesus is throwing here, if you want to refer to it as such. We're also being invited into the miracle. Jesus says, "Have the people sit down," to his disciples. However, the word used for sit down in verse 10, anapasein, really means take a place at the table in Greek. In other words, Jesus is telling his disciples to make sure that everyone pulls up a chair because everyone is invited at the Lord's table. And that's the real miracle that is taking place here. That's the gospel. That's the good news. Then Jesus says to gather up the leftovers so that nothing is wasted. This right here is a sure sign of the kingdom, of the new community, where there are no leftovers, whether those leftovers are food or people. Nothing is thrown aside. Nothing is not valued. We are all guests at the Lord's table. We aren't afterthoughts. We aren't nuisances. We aren't too much. We are all welcomed. We are all invited, and we are all included. In the kingdom, we all have worth. We all have value, and we all are loved. But wait, there's more. Because John saw yet one more thing in all of this. And it's mentioned twice. Once in verse 11, then it's referred back to in verse 23 after the actual miracle happens. All of this happened after Jesus gave thanks. Verse 23 actually calls that spot where the feeding of the 5,000 happened the place where they had eaten the bread after the Lord had given thanks. He didn't refer to it as the miracle spot. He didn't refer to it as abundant food hill. It's the place where they had eaten the bread after the Lord had given thanks. The emphasis isn't even on the miracle itself. The emphasis is on the fact that Jesus, Christ's self, practiced intentional gratitude. I know it's a mouthful of a title to name a place, but think about it. That's what John wants us to remember about, that this meal, this miracle happened after gratitude was expressed. Gratitude for the abundance that didn't look like it would be enough to begin with. It didn't even look like it was abundance in the beginning. Gratitude for the satisfaction that came out of hunger. You see, gratitude becomes a way of seeing and a way of being in the world if we practice it enough. We give thanks to God even for what is about to happen. We give thanks for what we might not yet see, but what we trust God will provide. Gratitude for something that we don't yet see, but are trusting that God will provide. As I shared a couple Sundays back, gratitude isn't always an easy thing to feel. Sometimes life just seems to kick you in the teeth. But it's a practice that we have to be intentional about, hence it being a spiritual discipline. The more we practice it, however, we find ourselves experiencing a mindset shift that allows us to more readily identify joy in our lives. More readily identify moments of love and kindness from God and even from others. We make the choice to live grateful to God first of all for the abundance that surrounds us. And when we do, we see how that gratitude spills over into the rest of our lives and then into the circles that we frequent. We become more aware of a woven human tapestry of love and caring as our love, caring, gratitude, and joy begins to mingle and mix with the love, caring, gratitude, and joy of others as well. It's a way of strengthening and intermingling and intertwining and interweaving relationships with one another. Jesus invites us to become more aware of that reality and to live gratefully every day. So, may we be a people who cultivate gratitude for what the Lord has done before now, is doing in our present moment now, and for what the Lord has yet to do in our lives. God bless.